Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Anne-Marie Owens. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Toronto Star. Thank you all for being here. Every day in our paper, the threats to democracy are on display. Declining trust in institutions, polarization, hyperpartisanship, social media bubbles, misinformation, hate, and extremism. The Star is a partner in this summit because, as our work makes clear, these are the defining challenges of the moment. And while they may not be as acute in Canada as they are in some of the other countries we're going to hear about today, they are clearly present here too. Events like this and conversations like the one you're about to hear are important because they're an essential part of a functioning democracy. Dialogue, respectful disagreement, mutual learning, and collective action in service of an important cause, a critical cause. We need to be engaged in more conversations like these, not fewer, if we are to uphold democracy and the underpinnings that make the democratic purpose successful. You are already doing your part in this by choosing to be here tonight and to engage in this conversation, and we thank you for that. Enjoy.
Welcome. My name is John Beebe, and I founded the Democratic Engagement Exchange in the Faculty of Arts at TMU 6 years ago. At the Exchange, our mission is simple: to build a vibrant and inclusive democracy where everyone living in Canada has a voice in shaping their future. But this simple mission is not easy. Democracy is how we make decisions together. It's also how we resolve our differences together. Democracy requires us to work together, even when we disagree with one another. Probably most importantly, when we disagree with one another. But around the world, we are increasingly seeing politicians practice a politics of division, one that demonizes the push and pull, the give and take that is essential to a healthy democracy. At the Exchange, we know that building a culture of healthy discourse is not easy. That is why we create tools and resources for community-based organizations and foster healthy dialogue like the forum we're in tonight. But this takes resources. So if you share our commitment to democratic engagement and healthy dialogue, we ask you to consider making a donation, because we really are a nonprofit that happens to be housed at a university, but this work takes investment, and we have to invest in our democracy, invest in our communities. Because no matter what matters to you, democracy matters. Tonight, we welcome two icons of Canadian political journalism. I get to introduce one of them. Susan Delacourt is a distinguished Canadian journalist and author with a career spanning over 3 decades. She has covered national political affairs with depth and insight, earning her reputation as one of Canada's foremost political commentators. Susan has lent her talents, and they are considerable, to several major newspapers, including the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, the National Post, and the Ottawa Citizen. She's now at the Star, and we are very grateful for our partnership with the Star for this evening. And at all of these, she has offered her insightful analysis and thoughtful reporting that has helped to inform our democratic discourse. But Susan has also experienced the dark side of success. Recently, her Twitter account was hacked, launching her into a wild world involving regaining her control of her online persona. And someday you can maybe hear this story. It's a great story, but a little bit challenging. So despite this digital mischief, Susan remains steadfast in her commitment to civil discourse. She has recently started a regular series with her colleague Matt Gurney that exemplifies this dedication, and I encourage you to check that out. But tonight, I have the great honor of inviting up onto the stage Susan and David, who will share their insights on where we are in the state of the world today and what we can do in Canada to ensure that we continue to have a healthy democratic discourse and a healthy and vibrant democracy that is foundational for all of us. So thank you very much.
Okay, does this work? So it falls to me to introduce David Frum, and I won't do the cliche need-to-know introduction because I'm going to introduce him. I first met David, I reminded him this, in 1996. I brought the article, and I was sent out to Calgary to cover a conference, The Winds of Change, it was called. And way ahead of his time, 7 years ahead of his time, as it turns out, David was trying to unite the right in Canada, the Reform Party and the Progressive Conservative Party. It took another 7 years for that to happen. Anyway, I said, I've got to do a profile of you. I introduced myself, and he said, let's have dinner. And we had dinner, and I will tell you, I was totally charmed. Unbelievably charmed. So I get back to my bureau, and they said, they kind of knew I was a bit of a lefty, and how was this going to go, having dinner with David Frum? And I said, oh, he was charming, he was lovely, it was very nice. And one of my colleagues said, you probably know the source of the quote. I could not find it. I think this comes from pre-Soviet days. I'd rather vote with the left and dine with the right. And, so it's sort of in that spirit that we're here tonight. I looked at that article too, and David at the time was just in the middle of moving to Washington. You were not there yet, and what you were trying to say was you wanted to be in the middle. It was really important for you to be in the middle of Canada and the United States. You didn't want to get dragged into the middle of the feud between the Reform Party and Conservatives either. And also you were trying to marry your journalism with your Republican activism. You were a proud Republican from the 1980s. I think he's done that quite well, frankly. And he now finds himself in the middle of something else. And I regard him now at the same center of whatever is going on with Republicanism in the United States. I read him all the time. And it's always insightful, and I'm glad he's there. Since getting to Washington, by the way, I should do the part of the introduction. He's now written 10 books, including one fiction. One fiction? Yeah. And he's the staff writer for The Atlantic. But as I said, he stands in the middle of what is going on down there with incredible calm. I'm turning my pages because I have a quote. And there's nothing middle, though, or wishy-washy about where David's standing. I know you know that. I read him just recently after Trump's conviction, his most recent piece on Trump, and he said, the United States can have a second Trump presidency, or it can retain the rule of law. It can't have both. And I think that's the kind of writing and the kind of insights that I'm looking forward to tonight, too. He has managed, he says in this article that he did with me, that he wants to keep a foot in Canada and a foot in the United States. And he's done that. He has a home in Wellington, in Prince Edward County, and one in Washington. And he's been keeping an eye on Canada and the United States, and we are very privileged to have the benefit of those insights here tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan, for that wonderful reminiscence. Thank you all for being here on this soupy Toronto night. I want to say a word just before we begin of tribute. 80 years ago, tomorrow, the D-Day invasion landed on the shores of Normandy. At this time, well, I guess at this time, very, very young people were wondering whether they would see the evening of the next day, whether they were in landing craft, whether they were in airplanes. The Canadians played a special role on D-Day, a role that I am constantly surprised to discover how poorly remembered it is in Canada. The Canadians, if you have visited Juno Beach, you know, of all the beaches, it's the one that is most vacation-like. You see that it's the shallowest, it's the shortest, it's the one with the little cabanas on it. The idea that people landed and died or drowned in this place is incredible. It was the beach that was furthest east. The Canadians on the first day made the deepest advance, and they cut an important road. But after that, their advance stopped and seemingly stalled. And when they teach this story, oftentimes, it is told as a story of anticlimax, that the Canadians did not make the penetration that the Americans did. But as important revisionist work on what happened that day reveals, that wasn't their job. The Canadians who landed at Juno Beach had the most guns, the most artillery pieces, the most tanks, the most anti-tank pieces of any of the Allied divisions. Their job was to take the expected punch. The 550 German tanks were just to the east. They had been fooled, and they were just to the east of the landing grounds, and the first place they would do is turn westward toward the landing grounds, and they would meet the Canadians first. And the Canadian job was to take the punch. And sometimes that is the hardest thing to do, the least glorious, the most painful, and sometimes it's the thing we're called on to do. And that may be one of the sub-themes of the talk tonight, is that sometimes what you have to do is take the punch for the benefit of others. I have some opening remarks. This is, however, called an exchange, so I don't propose to monologue. I am going to speak very briefly, and then we will have an exchange. But what I want to talk about tonight, and there are many things we could discuss, but I want to talk about 3 lessons from the recent past, from world experience, and then 3 lessons from the Canadian experience that might be useful in framing the discussion that we will then open with. Here are the 3 lessons. The first comes from the United States, and that is, remember that institutions is just a fancy word for people. There are no institutions that operate on themselves. Everything is the product of human collective action. One of the things that has been very striking is, Susan kindly quoted my article on the recent conviction of Donald Trump on felony charges. The charges that Donald Trump was convicted on, of course, pertain to his pre-presidential life. They're from when he was a candidate, and they reflect his earlier life as a kind of tabloid sleazeball. The American system of justice found it possible to hold Trump to account for his life as a tabloid sleazeball, as it has found it possible to hold him to account for his commercial frauds before he became president, both Trump University, for which he settled out of court for $25 million, and then his multi-level marketing scheme, that cost him nearly $500 million, and of course he was held to account for his defamation of the woman he sexually assaulted before he became president, and that was, I think, for about $90 million. What it is not found possible to do in time is to hold him to account for presidential acts, crimes against the Constitution. Those have been broken down in delay, as you may have seen in the papers just today. The Georgia case, the one that holds him to account for his attempt to suborn and create slates of fake electors in Georgia, that is postponed too, and it's not going to be heard, I think, until after the election. That's partly the fault of the Georgia prosecutor for getting herself into an alleged conflict of interest that now has to be adjudicated. But none of the major cases involving crimes against the Constitution will be heard within 4 years of the time they took place. They are not going to be resources available in time for the next election. And that is a failure of institutions, but it's a failure of people. And it's a reminder, don't look to the institutions to work automatically. There are no mechanisms here. There are only people. And one of the things that I often encounter, and Susan, you may have done this, and many of you have, people ask me for predictions. Do I think this will happen? Do I expect that? And I always say, I reject that question. Those questions about optimism and pessimism ask you to talk about the future as if it's a thing that exists, about which statements can be made, when in fact the future is something that we are going to do. And so the question is not what will happen, but what will you do? Because because just as there are no institutions, only people, you are one of the people. That is all there is. The second lesson of recent years, the first comes from the United States. The second lesson comes from our neighbor North America, Mexico, which just had a very important election on June the 2nd, and that is beware of left-right coding. So if you don't pay close attention to Mexican affairs, what you will have heard is that the left-wing populist President López Obrador has just handed over power to his chosen successor, a woman named Claudia Sheinbaum, the first woman to be president of Mexico. She's from a Jewish background in a predominantly Catholic country. This is presented as a great act of human progress. And of course, the one thing you're always told is that they are left-wing. But when you look more, I've spent a lot of time there reporting on it. When you look at what is going on in Mexico, what you see is it's got the same consolidation of power in the hands of the executive that you see in Hungary, that you saw during the law and justice movement in Poland, that Donald Trump aspires to. The independence of the courts have been compromised. Mexico's Independent Elections Commission have been compromised, has been subverted. And Mexico's 30-year career as a competitive two-party state seems to be drawing to a close as it reverts to what it was through most of the 20th century, a one-party state which has elections that are more or less free but not fair and not truly competitive, where the party that controls the state uses the state to control the elections. López Obrador is coded left, Trump is coded right, Viktor Orban is coded right, other people are coded left, but the mechanism, the issue, can be coded in a lot of ways, but the question of the consolidation of power in a way to inhibit free and fair elections and democratic choice, that threat can come from many places in the compass, and it's important to be not to be so excited by what it says on the label of the box that you neglect the ingredients inside the box. The third lesson comes from the experience of our European partners and allies. That Europe has seen the rise of parties of the far right in Germany, in France. It's seen separatist movements in Catalonia and Scotland, and it's of course seen the very complex story of British exit from the European Union. Often there has been foreign meddling. The Scottish referendum in 2015 was maybe the first example of this, of a very active Russian presence to try to persuade the Scots to leave the United Kingdom. Catalonia, the same thing. And of course, there was a lot of Russian backing of the Brexit referendum. And the parties of the far right, either clandestinely or in the case of the National Front in France, quite brazenly get funded by Russia. The lesson from Europe is Europeans are doing something both at once very bureaucratic and very romantic, trying to build a European identity. But along the way, that there has been a neglect of the symbols of nationhood. And those have become resources in the hands of people who use the nation to defeat the democratic project. Nationalism and democracy have always had an uneasy relationship to one another. On the one hand, nationalism is a threat to democracy. On the other hand, democracy arose as a meaningful idea only in a world of nation states. And it was people who were Democrats in the 19th century who were the early advocates of nationalism in places like Germany and like Italy, as opposed to the rule of kings who said you should follow me because of my first name, not because of my family name, my dynasty, not because I lead the nation. It is a terrible it is a terrible mistake to let those symbols go. And people who want to defend democratic ideals, despite their wariness of excessive nationalism, need to understand democracy and the nation state. Who else is voting but citizens of the nation state? Democracy and the nation state go together, and you mustn't surrender the symbols of the nation state. Now let me talk, and I've spoken for about 4 minutes, for 4 more, about some specific lessons from the Canadian experience. When I began walking this beat in Canada, it was now almost literally a decade ago, and the radical Tea Party movement was convulsing the United States and breaking all kinds of rules, including threatening to push the United States into national bankruptcy, default on the debt unless it got its way. And at that time, there were these far-right movements were on the rise in Europe, and as I mentioned, Scotland and Catalonia and Brexit. Canada didn't have much of that going on. And I remember very vividly a talk in particular. I was in a seminar room at the University of British Columbia, and I asked the students, graduate students, why they thought, their opinions, their guesses, as to why Canada seemed not to have experienced or what every other peer democracy was experiencing. And their answers came down to some form or another of, because we're so awesome. And I said, well, let me propose to you that Canadians belong to the same human species as everybody else, and that Canada is not a unique island of awesomeness on a planet of non-awesomeness. Let's try something else. And one of the things I drew their attention to that day was that Canada had come out of the traumatic experience of the Great Recession as the best performing peer democracy After the shock of 2008, 2009, Canada was the first country to return to pre-crisis levels of both output and employment. By 2011, the worst of the crisis was over in Canada, but it continued in the United States, and it continued even worse in Great Britain. So Canadians had the sense that they'd taken, it had been, of course, a shock. The Great Recession hit Canada hard, but Canada had recovered, was back on the path of growth. The middle class was doing well, and Canadians could compare their experience with that of people everywhere else and see they were doing better. And so that promoted de-radicalized politics. Well, now in 2020 and 2021, we've had another shock as harsh to the world economy as the Great Recession was. And Canada's coming out of this one, along with Great Britain, the worst performing of the peer democracies. So if being the best performing protected Canadians from radicalization in 2011, 2012, 2013, I think you need to think very hard about what does the poor performance of the Canadian economy coming out of COVID, what does that portend? The second thing the second lesson from Canada is to understand the relationship between high levels of immigration and democratic stress. Immigration, when managed properly, is a tremendous resource for the receiving country and, of course, for the immigrants themselves. It can be economically enriching, culturally enriching, spiritually enriching. It can bring a lot of benefit, but it has to be managed. People have to feel that it's under control, and it has to be in some relationship, some reasonable proportion to the size of the existing national population. When people lose that feeling, as happened on the continent of Europe with the refugees from the Syrian civil war and all the greater Middle East who all flooded into Germany in 2016, or as happened in the United States with the movements from the South just before the election of Donald Trump, when people feel that their borders are not in control, they turn to darker forces that will do it. As I wrote in an article for The Atlantic, this was briefly the cover, but it was considered too inflammatory, but I stand by it. If liberals won't control borders, fascists will. And so that is a lesson from Canada. Canada's had a huge surge in immigration, at the same time as it seems to be making no serious effort to build more housing. And those are two locomotives on a direct collision course, each with the other, and it can be very disturbing. And the last lesson for Canada comes from the third thing I said of the lessons from Europe about not letting go the symbols of nationhood. Canada, over the past few years, has been in a period of national self-flagellation about the sins, real and imagined, of the Canadian past. The Parliament of Canada, in a vote, self-accused Canada of genocide. What a terrible libel against the country. And unsurprisingly, this leads people who believe in their country to look at the people who are in charge of governing the country and say, can you even speak for us? If you dislike us so much, if you blame us so much, how do you lead us? Never let go the symbols of the nation. Democracy needs them. Be proud of who you are. This is a country with, among its many blessings of natural resources and talented people, has always suffered from a weak self-concept, a weak idea of who it is, of what it means to be Canadian. To let that go, to throw it away, that is beyond reckless. That is dangerous. And that is another lesson from the recent past that I hope Canadians will learn from the bad experience of others. So let me pause there. That was about 8 minutes, and we can have an open conversation, an exchange.
Good timekeeper. Thank you for that, David. That was, we had, as one does, a pre-call for this, and when David was putting out some of his ideas, I thought, first of all, I could listen to this for an hour, but there's lots, I think there's lots you'll want to ask about that. There's lots I want to ask about it. I guess the first thing that grabbed me was when you spoke about the left and right. And I think, given that we're supposed to be on opposite sides, do you actually think there is a left and a right anymore?
Well, look, I think the structure of the human brain is hardwired so that there's a Gilbert and Sullivan song that every child that is born alive is born a little liberal or else a little conservative. I think there's some truth to that. I think we are born. Some people value complexity and diversity. Some people value simplicity and clarity. We are born with certain psychological predispositions that push us in one way or another. But what the food for those predispositions, that completely depends on cultural context. What it means to be a liberal or a conservative is going to be constantly changing. And one of the features of American life is as human life extends, which is a great blessing, as smoking recedes, another great blessing, we're getting a lot of leaders in their 70s, 80s, and later who are carrying around maps of the world that have been out of date for a time. And so that's a real hazard. So yes, I think those terms are meaningful. I think they map to real things in the human psyche. But you need to always be sure that you are talking about the questions of today. And there are some questions that never change. There's some questions that go in and out of fashion. Obviously, when interest rates were basically nothing, no one thought about debts and deficits. Now that we have interest rates again, we do think about debts and deficits. But I think it's also true, this concept of the horseshoe, anti-vaccination manias, is that a left-wing or a right-wing thing? Yeah. Being on Putin's side versus Ukraine, is that a left-wing or a right-wing thing? Is disrespecting independent institutions, is that a left-wing thing or a right-wing thing? And what you find is often that just as the extremes meet, the differences in the middle, although real, are, if your extremes are powerful, those differences at the middle may be less immediately relevant than the difference between the middle and the extremes.
This is a pet subject, maybe not so much to a Toronto audience, but I'm from Ottawa. What did you make of the convoy? There were lots of thoughts about this in Ottawa,
yeah.
and one of them, a popular one, was we saw it as Trumpism, the kind of thing you've been writing against, yeah. Slipping over our border here. My thoughts on the convoy. The first is, look, a free society thrives on debate and dissent, and there's a lot to argue about in the COVID response. And obviously, given such a shock, so fast, so mysterious, obviously the first guesses are not going to be correct. Everyone remember washing your hands all the time? And that turned out to be useless. 2 weeks to bend the curve.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an unfair criticism. Why didn't you have a time machine to go into the future and get the answers that we need now? Well, if I could have built the time machine, I could solve a lot of problems. But what liberal societies also have to do is keep in mind what is dissent and what is law breaking. Mm-hmm. And you have to be very clear that the laws are enforced, and the laws are enforced equally upon everyone. I think one of the things that has made these encampments at American universities and the Israel-Palestine dispute so flashpoint is everyone understands that the universities are not applying their rules equally. If these were pro-life demonstrators, the application of the rules would be completely different. Universities and other institutions have played favorites, and people see that. So my response to the convoy is it legal to park your truck in the middle of a street in Ottawa? If it's not, and I believe it's not, it shouldn't be legal for anybody. And the consequences need to be meaningful. Because whatever your point of view, you want to write an article, you want to have a public meeting, you want to organize candidates for office, you want to have schools where you train people how to knock on doors and win votes, you want to do any of those things, be my guest. No matter how much I disagree with what you want to do, I recognize that you're playing a healthy role in our society. Maybe I'm wrong. But if you want to park your truck in the middle of the street and block an ambulance, I don't care what your cause is, you can't do that. And the state has to have the capability to enforce its rules. And that is true whether you're protesting COVID, whether you're protesting Gaza, whatever your cause is. Once you are breaking the law, once you're engaged in symbolic violence, it's not the same as real violence, but shooting a gun at a Jewish day school at 6 o'clock on a Shabbat morning, obviously there's probably nobody there. But you intend to set a message, I'm thinking about it. So the state has to have rules. The rules have to be enforced. They have to be enforced equally for everybody. And then once we understand that, then go knock on doors. You got a message, go sell it to the voters.
I think I think I want to get you to go into a time machine right now. We're sitting here watching across the border. Are any Trump fans in the house? Really? I'm going to try to speak for most of us. I think most of us do not want to have a Trump here. We do not want what you are witnessing
Yeah.
in the United States to happen here. I think that's fairly safe assumption. Again, stop me if I'm wrong. If you could go back in time and watch the development of Donald Trump and what happened to your
Yeah.
beloved Republican Party, what warning signs did the Republicans miss, and what warning signs
Yeah.
may we be missing here?
Well, with any historical event, they're both deep causes and triggering causes, and you have to pay attention to both. Because, look, it really is true. Donald Trump lost the popular vote to Hillary Clinton by 3 million votes. Had the Electoral College turned out slightly differently, you would not remember that as a close election. He got a smaller share of the vote than Mitt Romney did in 2012. He got a smaller share of the vote than John Kerry did in 2004, and he got a much smaller share of the vote than Al Gore did in 2000, when actually Al Gore won by 300,000 votes, the popular vote. And of course, he got a smaller share of the vote than Hillary Clinton. Had the Electoral College bounced a slightly different way, we would not be asking, it would be obvious to everybody that Trumpism was not a popular idea. By the way, when he ran for re-election in 2020, he got a slightly higher share of the vote, but he still got less than he still got less than Kerry and Romney and Al Gore. So part of the story of Trumpism is just small things can have big effects. James Comey's vacillation about how to deal with the FBI investigation, Hillary Clinton probably staying in politics too long past her date. These small things had big effects, but they're also deep things, because there's no mistaking that Donald Trump has a hold on the Republican Party that no one, not even Ronald Reagan, ever had before him. So there's obviously something deep there. And I think what is going on there is a rotation that is happening in every pure democracy, where politics, one of the most important questions in politics used to be your relationship to the way wealth was produced in society. So if you worked on a factory, you voted one way. If you worked in an office, you voted another way. If you belonged to a union, you voted one way. If you belonged to management, you voted another way. Those things have become, as the economy has changed, those relationships have changed. Instead, what matters are your relationship to the cultural attitudes that come with higher education, how you feel about those things. And what we are seeing in every democracy is that a great shift, like a counterclockwise turn in the distribution of votes. Who votes conservative in the UK looks very different from who voted conservative in the UK in 1975. In Germany, it used to be if you worked in the office and you worked in management, you were with the Christian Democrats. If you worked in a factory and were in a union, you were in the Social Democrats. And both those two parties are about half the strength they were a generation ago. And the kind of person whose parents were Christian Democrat is now probably in the Greens, and the kind of person whose parents were in the Social Democrats might be in the far-right Alternative for Germany, because what is driving politics are these cultural attitudes associated with higher education. And so we have a party system where we're absorbing this giant cultural change, and we're adjusting to it. And we have to find positive ways of adjusting to it, not negative ways. And that's Donald Trump then, with his genius for seeing the weaknesses in people, for exploiting cowardness and lack of integrity, for finding the flaw in people and institutions, and for having that criminal sixth sense about which burglar alarms are on and which burglar alarms are not working. He found his way through that, and the Electoral College helped him do it, and so did James Comey in 2016.
Is there, what's it like when you talk to fellow Republicans? We all have this sense that they're putting on a show of support for him, but laughing sort of behind their hands.
Well, some of my friends have become true believers.
They have.
There's a play by Eugene Ionesco called Rhinoceros that I feel to me like it describes our life. So it's set in a small French seaside town, and everyone's sitting around the cafe. Life is normal, and one day you hear coming out of nowhere the bellowing sound of a rhinoceros walking down the street, and suddenly there's more than one rhinoceros, and suddenly the people you know are turning into rhinoceroses, and suddenly and gradually everybody in town becomes a rhinoceros except for the one town drunk who is wondering if the reason he's not a rhinoceros is he's too much of a loser to be a rhinoceros. and the play ends with this speech where he tries to become a rhinoceros, he fails, and then he speaks defiantly, and you are left to interpret whether this is true defiance or whether it's just sour grapes.
Yeah.
Whether
It does sound a bit like a life story, doesn't it?
so that, but
Not
what
to
also
call you the
happened-
town truck.
What also, so that's, I mean, so I've seen people really believe, and they're motivated by what they dislike. I mean, there are people who love Trump, but there are many more people who hate something and are drawn to Trump because he at least hates what they hate.
Yeah.
And so the conversation I have with some of the friends is, I think, and you may be wrong, you may be, we have fallible judgments, but if you are acting on the basis of what you love, you're going to come up with healthier decisions, even if ultimately mistaken, than if you act on the basis of what you hate.
Yeah. And that kind of brings me back to Canada, because we are about to go into an election next year, I expect, where there's going to be a lot of hate thrown around. There's a lot of hate right now being thrown around. In fact, people say parliaments have always been nasty, but the personal and visceral tone of our politics right now has made people liken it to Trumpism coming here.
Yeah.
The lowering of the bar, and I do want to talk about the media. First of all, are you watching that? Do you see that happening in Canada? And do you think that the next election, as a sort of a hate fest for Justin Trudeau, is a positive thing for the country?
Yeah, well, look, I think it remains true, despite the warnings I gave, that Canadian politics, especially Canadian federal politics, has less of these things that are going around than other people's politics do. And I think a lot of that is attributable to the fact that Canada has had, at least until very recently, a very well-performing middle class relative to what has been the middle class experience in the United States, in Great Britain, and even on the continent of Europe. And I think it remains true that a healthy middle class, more people feeling they have something to lose from politics than feeling they have something to gain from politics, that's a stabilizer, and Canada still has that. I think also the extremely regional nature of Canadian politics makes it very hard to sustain hyper-ideological parties. Because in the end, people from Saskatchewan, it's hard to persuade them to care about things as intensely about the things that the people in New Brunswick care intensely about. One of the things you see in the United States is that Trumpism is all about getting people all over the country to subordinate their actual practical concerns to Donald Trump's grievances, mostly imaginary and all of them self-inflicted. So it's harder to do that in Canada. And then I think also the fact that the federal and the provincial political systems are so non-integrated one into the other means everyone is keeping two sets of political books in their heads. And Canadians are very practiced at voting, first, not the parties having different names oftentimes at one level than another, and even if they have the same names, voting different ways in your elections federally and provincially. So I think there are a lot of circuit breakers in Canada. But what Canada does share with everybody else is we have this new and much more intimate media culture. It used to be that people have always disliked people who are different. It was just often in those days, it was much harder to know what people thought about you. Now there's no escaping it. And when I say think about you, it could be you personally, if you're active at all, in even like the smallest ways, town council, writing, there it is on your phone, in your pocket, the device with which you make restaurant reservations. That device is telling you how much, something nasty that somebody has to say about you or the people you love. And so I think that preys on all of us. And we're going to have to find some way to cope with it. It's not going to be uninvented, but we have to find some way, just as we've had to find ways to deal with the hyperabundance of calories, the other things that are made available to us. We have to find some way to cope with it. And we're going to have some way to cope with that.
Go on a Twitter diet.
Well, or find some way, I don't know what the answer is. And I'm not holding myself out as a person who has the answers because I'm as vulnerable to it as anybody else. But anyway, I think Canada is still true. It's less in Canada than other places, but no, Canadians are not more awesome than other people.
I think they Um, There was a lot of talk this morning at the sessions that I attended about the media, of which you and I are part, and we've seen all the changes. Is our media robust enough to withstand the threats that are coming to it?
Well, I talked before about carrying around a map that is out of date. And when people of my vintage talk about the media, we tend to mean TV stations that were on the air in 1972, media companies that have been in existence for a century or more. So we need to begin by understanding the most important media companies in the world today are Facebook and TikTok. So test whatever generalization you're going to make about the media. Ask yourself, is it true of Facebook and TikTok? Because if it's not, you're not talking about the thing that really matters. And so if you implicitly mean the New York Times or the CBC or the Toronto Star, you are probably make a statement that is going to be false about the effect of media. TikTok, the question that how is that affecting it? So people are being social media is media for most people, and for more and more people, because younger and younger people, because every year people who were young at the beginning of the advent of social media are a little less young. Facebook was created in 2006. Twitter in 2009-10, YouTube about the same time, Reddit a little later. TikTok is the newest, but still, I mean, that we now have people in their 20s who are TikTok.
Are you on TikTok?
I stay away from it because I don't like the Chinese government to listen to my conversations. But
Good call.
but that's an idiosyncratic choice.
Speaking of which, have you been watching our foreign interference discussions
Yes.
here? Your thoughts?
Canada has had the blessing and curse of not in a long time having had to be really responsible for its own national security. That Canada has outsourced a lot of that to the United States, or maybe more cynically, as a Canadian politician once said to me, Canada faces two kinds of national security problems. There are those from the United States, and we can't do anything about those, and there are those from everyone else, and those are the Americans' problem. But the effect of this is that Canada has not developed a serious national security culture. The people who are in charge of regulating Canadian banking are as sophisticated and knowledgeable as their counterparts anywhere on earth. And they can build very successful careers, whether that in the public policy realm or then finally in consulting or maybe ending up working for one of the big banks. But that kind of thing is done at the highest level of sophistication. The people who negotiate trade treaties for Canada operate at the highest levels of sophistication. But with national security, there is a tendency to treat it as kind of the poor relation. It is, and for Canadian politicians to subordinate national security concerns to domestic political concerns. It is a terrible thing that the government of India would carry out an assassination on Canadian soil, if indeed it did so, and it sure looks like they did. That's a terrible thing. But one of the reasons Canada has not found as much support from its friends and allies in its indignation about this is they also are conscious, look, Canada ignored the problem of Sikh extremism on Canadian soil, and for reasons of political advantage. Canadian politicians found it useful, as it ignored Tamil terrorism before, as it has ignored a lot of terrorism from the Middle East, because Canadian politicians just refuse to say, this is the most important thing I deal with. It is all that Canadian national security considerations are often subordinated. And I think that has been true now with the foreign interference. This is going to be a very intimate planet. And Canada, because of its immigration decisions, is going to be home to diasporas of people who have property and relatives and points of pressure all over the world. And if you're going to preserve the integrity of your democracy, you need to take all of those past decisions into account and be really serious about it. And that means building a proper domestic intelligence service. That means having meaningful laws. And that means developing a culture where it's the prime ministers do not ignore these warnings for domestic political reasons. One of my pet reforms for Canada, assuming the Senate is otherwise unfixable, which I think it is, at a minimum, that there should grow a practice of of almost automatic, barring some violation, promotion of certain roles in national security to Senate seats afterwards. The former heads of CSIS, the former heads of the RCMP, two or three of the most senior people in the military. There should be a practice that they always go to the Senate.
Interesting.
So you develop 10% of that body with non-party backgrounds, with deep national security, so that there's a place where these things can be debated more independent of party whips than happens in the House of Commons.
I kind of like that idea. It's a good one. We are coming to I want to ask one more question. I will use my, and it's actually the question you asked, you posed earlier, what will you do?
Yeah.
And I know you don't want to talk about whether there's a Donald Trump victory or not,
Yeah.
but I do want to go back to that quote from your recent article. As you were watching, the United States face what you call a very stark choice, either the rule of law or a second Trump presidency. You asked it, what will you do?
Oh, well, I'll keep at my little potato stand selling baked potatoes, but let me elide that a little bit differently.
What should we do?
Let me tell you about two futures that are on offer. What does the future look like if Donald Trump wins, and what does the future look like if Joe Biden wins? If Donald Trump wins, he will arrive being convicted as a convicted felon, facing many more prosecutions that have been all delayed until 2025 for his other more serious crimes against the Constitution, and facing $500 million in damages and maybe more to come. His top priority is going to be to fight all of those things, and fight them by breaking the rule. When I say that wasn't a figure of speech. I mean, he is going to be claiming things like the president has the power to to pardon himself. The president has the power to use the federal executive to pardon himself for state offenses. Some of Donald Trump's people have begun to argue there are theories by which the president can use federal power to pardon for state offenses. He is going to try to get rid of all the special counsels. He's going to try to shut down pending cases. The Department of Justice has long had a policy that it will not begin a criminal investigation of a serving president. But the question of, well, what happens if there's an active trial that has already commenced, and this is not a matter of policy, but a matter of law, what happens to those? Well, he'll be claiming powers to shut all of them down. And the system will not passively submit to this. People won't say, oh, you've mastered the Harry Potter cheat codes, I guess that means that these trials all stop. It's going to be, we are going to be talking about nothing else. That will be the first 2 years of the Trump presidency, with him claiming powers to shut down law and his opponents objecting if they have a foothold in one or another House of Congress using that. We're probably on our way to a third impeachment crisis, almost certainly on our way to a third impeachment crisis. And nothing else will happen. And foreign adversaries of the United States will see a paralyzed center with Donald Trump turning against Ukraine, trying to bust up NATO, trying to wreck the world trading system with tariffs and other barriers. It's going to be chaos. If Biden wins, no important question is resolved. That it will be, Biden will, if Biden wins, he will not win because there's been Biden mania sweeping the United States. He will win because the master question of the Trump years, if you look at any poll question, it'll go blah, 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 Trump, blah, blah, blah. Answer 4652. Because Biden will have found some way to activate that 52, which is made up of everybody from Bernie Sanders to Ann Romney. Mm-hmm. So that his sprawling, messy, disputatious 52%, if he can pull them all together for one last performance of the band and get himself reelected, that 52% immediately falls apart. Mm-hmm. And turns on each other. First, the Democratic Party turns on each other. All the people who think they would be better presidents than Kamala Harris, and that's a long list of people who think that. They may be right, they may be wrong, but they think it. They turn on her. And the Democratic Party rips itself to pieces in disputes between the liberal center and the progressive left. And Biden probably won't have a mandate for doing the things that need to be done, whether it's addressing the deficit or climate change or figuring out a way to pay for the more expensive defense establishment that you're going to need in a world in which China and Russia and Iran are on the rampage. Nothing will be solved. But what you will have saved is the possibility of solving those questions. Those questions will all be available for the new forces, the people who are not in their 80s, to address. And we will begin to have a more useful and productive discussion than the question, should the president be allowed to break the law whenever he feels like it? We'll be saying, how do you pay for the debt? How do you finance defense spending? How do you deal with the climate change? How do societies that are aging and that are not replacing themselves, how do they deal with making sure they have enough immigration to meet the needs of their society, of their economy, but not so much as to polarize their society? All of those debates remain up for grabs, but they will remain up for grabs, and that will be the victory.
Well, I hope you keep writing through them. It's, thank you for this conversation. We're done, but you're not.
So I, like you, Susan, could spend the evening just listening to the conversation here, but we do have time for a couple of questions from you. We just ask that they're questions because we want to hear the response. That's what we're here for. We are going to have a little informal gathering afterwards. If you want to hang out, have things that you provoked, ideas you want to share, there's time for that. But now we have a couple of times for questions. Max here has the mic, so if you want to raise your hand, we will come to you, and we'll have a couple of questions here. So I see one here, and then one more in the back there. And if you can come to the edge, make your way to the aisle, that'd be great. But yeah, and Max will hold the mic so we can have questions.
Thank you. I was taken by your comment about national symbolism. The recent upside-down flags in the United States have me very concerned, reminiscent of Confederate flags. My question is, how close is the United States to a civil war?
I would say it depends what you mean by civil war. Look, the 21st century very seldom sees the kind of big unit conflicts that you saw in the 19th and even the 20th century. Ukraine is shocking to us because it's so unusual. We're not used to seeing that. But political violence doesn't look the way it did in the 1860s, and it doesn't parse on geographic lines. I mentioned Mexico before. Under the 6 years of the outgoing president, Mexico has seen about 180,000 violent deaths, almost all of them inflicted by what you might call a criminal insurgency against the state. The mass shootings that disgrace the United States are sub-political. When an aimless young man is consumed by hatred of women or people of a different ethnicity and gets a weapon and kills a bunch of them to make his point, that's not exactly political terrorism because he's also confused and his ideas often don't make a lot of sense and they don't hook up to other people with similar ideas and he's not part of a movement exactly, but he's finding his ideas online. So that kind of bubbling, sub-political violence, I worry about that a lot. I don't worry about California going to war with Texas.
Thank you for being here. Your point that everyone should follow the law appears to assume that all laws are fair and just. I believe it was Thomas Jefferson who said, when injustice becomes law, resistance becomes a duty. There was a time when it was illegal for African Americans to sit in front of the bus until someone decided to break the law. So how does your supposition conflict with the concept of civil disobedience, and how do people protest and protect themselves against unjust laws, especially in times when even the basic right to freedom of speech and assembly is challenged, and who adjudicates?
Well, thank you. It's an interesting question and one very timely. So the civil disobedience of the civil rights movement was always predicated on respect for law. That the way the civil disobedience would happen would be there would be a law. It wouldn't be a law. The front of the bus was not exactly a law. It was a practice. So you would defy the practice, and then you would submit to the punishment of the authority. And the theory of civil disobedience, as articulated by people like all the way back with Martin Luther King and Henry David Thoreau, was when people saw the law being carried out, that would trigger a democratic reaction. They would say, this law is unjust. You shouldn't be doing it. You shouldn't be hauling that lady off in handcuffs just because she sat in the seat that was closest to her. The idea was not to resist the law. The idea was to theatrically submit to break the law, theatrically submit to the law in a way that galvanized the feeling of your fellow citizens. When Thomas Jefferson said a lot of things, he often had fantasies of violence. He said, the tree of liberty needs to be refreshed with the blood of martyrs. That's the favorite quote of everyone who's taken an AK-47 or an AR-15 to a shooting. If you have a working, a functionally just society, you have to work out peacefully. Now my lines would be, you want to give a speech, give a speech. You want to carry a placard, carry a placard. If you feel that there's a particular law that you feel is unjust, like telling you can't sit in this place and this, then break the law, and then wait for the cops to come and arrest you, and then argue your case at trial, or hope to galvanize the successors. But to defy the law in a clandestine way, to use symbolic violence, that's an attack on authority. And the people who are doing that, they're very sure they're just. So are the Baader-Meinhof gang. We're also very sure they were just. The Red Brigades. You are on your way to political terrorism. I think that the path that when people use this language of resistance very loosely, but they are entertaining dreams of violence. And the fact that it is ending up with these acts of symbolic violence, like shooting a gun at a school, when the school is closed and there are no students there, probably, and you're probably going to miss the custodian if there is one, but you are preparing the way for the real thing and habituating people to the real thing, and that is radically unacceptable.
So that's what we have time for tonight.
Well, let's end on a more uplifting note than that.
Okay, all right. I would love that. Yeah, David. Yeah, if you can.
You got to go out tap dancing here.
Yeah.
People.
Okay.
Okay. I want to first thank everybody here for being here, because you are engaged. You are engaged in the fundamental action of a democratic society. This is what makes it go. And so everyone here has taken time out of their lives to do something remarkable and important. It's like you've all done your own, like sucking the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and burying it in a pit by making the air a little cleaner and better. So thank you. I'm honored to be with you, and I'm grateful to you for being here, and you've shown the way.
Well, as we might anticipate, I cannot put it better than that. And I would say also thank you to you, thank you to David, thank you to Susan for joining us and bringing some pointed and critical conversation about what it's going to take to build a healthy democracy here. Again, we encourage you all to take this back out into your communities. One of the things we heard earlier today during the Canadian Vote Summit is those small acts of conversations with our neighbors, with our friends, with our relatives, which are becoming less and less often. That we're scared of these conversations, that we have to learn to re-engage. And it can start with just friendly engagement. But it is talking about the things that matter to us, talking about the critical issues you heard here tonight, bringing these back into our communities, because that's what is at the core of a healthy and strong democracy. So thank you all for being here. We welcome to continue the conversation in our reception area. We don't have any more beverages or food for you, but you're still welcome to feed on the ideas. So thank you. Good night.